Hello, and welcome to the webinar, Broadening Participation of People with Disabilities in Science. This webinar is our third in our Broadening Diversity series as part of a larger initiative called Moving the Needle. This initiative was initiated through a collaboration with iDigBio, Blue, Small Collections Network, and Beacon. To learn more or join our work and visit the links in the sections, in the notes sections above. The webinar will consist of 3 presentations, followed by a Q&A session with our speakers. You can enter any questions or comments in the chat, and Gabi and I will read them one at a time for our speakers to answer. I can also enable microphones if anyone wants to ask a question directly. Finally, and most importantly, please complete our very short survey that's located in the notes section. I'll be posting in the chat throughout. We need this information for our NSF reporting as well as to improve these webinars in the future. This voluntary survey is the alternative we are using instead of requiring registration for our webinars. We feel really strongly that requiring registration would be a barrier to participation for some, but that means we need your help. So please complete that survey when you leave here today. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce.
All right, so my background is I have a PhD in clinical psychology. I actually sit at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, which is where our Cincinnati UCED is located. A UCED is a University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, and your state also has a UCED. I included the link to where you can find your UCED. You may be, like Ohio, one of the lucky states that has more than one UCED, but they're a great resource for in our language, our network language is technical assistance, which means if you have a question about how to integrate, whether it be employees with disabilities or students with disabilities into your STEM programs or your museum science programs, they can provide consultation for how to make that happen. So UCEDs are a little bit complicated in that we don't do the direct work, so they won't necessarily show up to your site and show you how to do it, but they can connect you to experts and resources who can. So I encourage you to reach out to our UCED network and get in touch. So I am also a professor and a curriculum developer. I'm especially interested in developing curriculum with universal design in mind, which is a term you're going to hear me use this afternoon. And I've contributed to a toolkit for psychology doctoral training program directors to include trainees with disabilities. And I always approach disability from the perspective of disability as a cultural competence. Not only do I personally view disability as part of my culture, but framing it as cultural competence allows us to see it in a different way than we have in the past. So where are people with disabilities? Gabi's going to talk a little bit more about this, but there are 3 main factors that I wanted to address about why people with disabilities are underrepresented. So we have the preparation of students with disabilities is lacking, the access to facilities, like including websites, equipment, programs is lacking, and then also the challenge of finding acceptance by the people who kind of are the gatekeepers of these programs. Related to preparing students with disabilities, we know research tells us that training programs are strengthened by inclusion of diverse students. It's also most reflective of what our workforces are and are becoming today. So it's no question the best route to go, but making it happen is often easier said than done. But there's not too much of a gap in between there, not as much as I think people may think. So it's really important to find mentorship opportunities available to students, and those are available in a broad scheme, such as more general STEM programs that provide mentorship across the various fields included under the STEM umbrella. And then there are also some specific opportunities. So for example, I've benefited from connections to other psychologists with disabilities, and there are discipline-specific mentorship programs as well. Assistive tech may be an option to bridge inclusion, and one of the more fascinating statistics I think is that the vast majority of accommodations, whether it be in your workplace or in your lab, are well under $500. So many accommodations are free, and then the majority past that are less than $500. So we're not often talking about something that is a great expense. And finally, just encourage students with disabilities to explore STEM fields. We think of that as a basic suggestion, but too often it's overlooked as an option. When preparing, I was trying to think of kind of the ultimate do's or don'ts, and one of the confusing thing is that it can vary for people. So people with disabilities are a very diverse group. There's no one set of rules for all of us. So I think in general you want to think about it in a framework of ethics, not just etiquette. So in terms of science, we know that justice is something that's required by many of our ethics codes. And justice means fairness and equitable distribution of benefits. So we have to uphold that value in what we do and in our actions as professionals. And don't be discouraged that many do's and don'ts aren't universal. So don't kind of take the approach of, well, I thought that's what I was supposed to do, and now I'm told I'm not. Um, so as an example of that, you may have heard the term person first language, and it's a way of writing or talking about disability where you put the person first. So if I'm talking about a person who's recently come into my office who uses a wheelchair, I might say, well, Sarah, she has a disability. Um, that's person first language. But alternatively, some of us choose to use identity first language because disability is such an integral part of us that for myself, it doesn't make sense to say that I'm a person with a disability any more than it makes sense to say that I'm a person who is a woman. I just say I'm a woman. So for me, I intentionally use I'm a disabled woman, and that's called identity first language. As a professional, I still use person first in writing because I know that not everyone embraces identity first language, and many times it actually can cause some confusion if people think that the only reason I'm not using person first is because I haven't heard of it. So that's an example of that there's not one way to do something. When in doubt, ask the person, ask the individual. So in the case of language, you could say, how do you identify? Or if you're developing materials for a program and you're not sure what language to use related to disability, definitely include people with disabilities on your task force, on your subject matter expert teams that look over this material. And disability is diversity. It's natural. These are a few videos that I won't be playing today, but that I hope that you might consider. They're very short. Well under the In the Awkward campaign has their commercials actually that ran in Britain based on the idea that many of our interactions that hold us back related to disability are because of our concern of being awkward and how we really need to push through that. Being awkward is not the end of the world, and how can we get through that to enjoy positive interactions and include more people. So these videos would be great to put, of course, in student programs or classes or courses, but they'd also be a great way to kick off a staff meeting or cultural competency exercise as a team, teamwork, team building. When you look at disability in terms of not only the number of people who have disabilities, but also who are touched by disability, it's a very large number. So this could be integrated in lots of different ways, and also just an opportunity to celebrate National Disability Employment Awareness Month, which is in October. And the images there are the free posters that the Department of Labor puts out close to that time, and you can put them around your workplace. Finally, including people with disabilities in research. If you're a researcher, there are many pieces of research that support how the benefits to this. It makes your findings more generalizable. It makes less bias in scientific conclusions. We can look back to other eras of where women without disabilities were not included in research, and how it's taken us a while, and we're still working on catching up in some areas. People with disabilities are even further behind on that curve. So we need to work on that together as scientists. And also another benefit is the greater speed in the use of knowledge, especially when it's something that people with disabilities experience or relate to, depending on the research itself. A couple of terms that I'm not going to go into, but that I found extremely interesting when I was preparing for this, related to methodology, adaptive intervention, and then I have some more specific examples of that. Things like sequential multiple assignment randomized trial and multi-phase optimization strategy. These are terms that I hope, if you are interested in kind of the universal design of research trials and study designs, these are methodology approaches that kind of work around the area of, well, how do you account for scientifically if someone is going to approach your intervention in a different way because of their disability. So I'm continuing to look into this. It's definitely piqued my curiosity, so I'm appreciative of that for being with you all today too. I just want to conclude that the inclusion of people with disabilities, it's not a nice thing to do. It's not something we just should do because we think we should. It's innovative, it's the just thing to do, and it's necessary to meet the aims of science. And feel free to reach out to me. I know our contact information will be shared. I've shared both my email, and I know that if email is not accessible to you, phone is another option. So, and my slide reads, I celebrate disability culture. Diversity makes our world a better place. Thank you all. And I'm going to stop sharing so Gabi can jump in.
Okay, hi everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sounds like yes. Okay, so sorry about the technical difficulties earlier. I'm sorry I didn't get to introduce you, Dr. Ayers, but I think our presentations go really well together, like you said. So I'll just jump into talking a little bit about what I can contribute to this conversation. So a little bit about me. I'm a third-year PhD student in marine geology at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT. I'm studying caves and climate, so I use caves to look at records of past climate change, and I really enjoy that work. I work in both the lab in the field, which for me is caves, or in this selfie of me here, I'm on a small mountain in Maine and on the computer. So that just gives you a little bit of perspective on what I do each day. My scientific path started when I was really young. I have a picture of me as a baby here making a funny face. And I was always really interested in science. So as an undergrad, I got my Bachelor of Arts in Earth and Oceanographic Science at Bowdoin, and I really enjoyed that program. So I decided to continue on in a PhD program. So I'm now about halfway through, as I said, and I have 2 question marks here showing that I'm not quite sure what's coming next in my scientific path. But what I do know now is that I've been having some health issues, and that has changed where I think my path is going to go. So my perspective is really limited. As Dr. Ayers said, each disability is different, and there are no universal truths or do's and don'ts. But for me, I just wanted to specify that I have an often invisible acquired physical disability. So that means that I did not have my disability from birth. And fieldwork is a requirement for my job. I also have an ongoing diagnosis process. So all of that colors my experience as a person with a disability or a disabled person, depending on your preference for language. So what I've had to learn so far is a lot of self-advocacy, vulnerability, and figuring out where I fit in the disability community. So these are all things that some people start the process earlier on or much later on, but for me, that's something I'm still going through. So I'd be more than happy to talk to anyone who's trying to navigate that themselves as well. I wanted to make the point that access and including people with disabilities is about much more than just physical access, whether you can enter the building, whether you can be in the room, whether you can hear or see what's happening. And I have a picture of my calendar here for the past 2 weeks and this week, and each star is a doctor's appointment in a place that is half an hour from my school. So once a week approximately I have different doctor's appointments, and they all take me a long time to get to. It's not cheap to deal with these health issues, and this diagnosis process has taken about 2 years. So that just shows you a little bit about how my disability and my health has impacted my science and my productivity. Even though I can always get into the door and I can always sit at my desk and do the work I need to do, sometimes I can't even be here because I have to put my health first. Another problem that I didn't realize was an issue until it started to affect me is the brain fog that a lot of people who have chronic pain sometimes describe. There are other disabilities where that also comes into play, but it sort of feels like your brain is working at only 30% or 50%, and that can come in because you're distracted or just because the cognitive load of dealing with pain and other sensations in your body can be so difficult. So I'm sure our 2 psychologists, PhDs, can tell us more about that than I can, but
For me, it just means that sometimes I feel like I'm wading through a huge amount of peanut butter when I'm just trying to read a scientific article. And so that part of my scientific journey has become more significant than I thought it would with a physical disability. And the last point I wanted to make is that there are a lot of small issues that can build up. So maybe I feel a little bit bad about being gone for an hour, and that's a small issue, but the next day I might have to sit the whole time when I'm doing lab work. And as those very small changes that I have to make to my career and the way that I do my work build up, it feels like a really significant change for me. So that's been something I'm navigating. For me, as I said, field trips are basically a required part of my job, and I have a picture here on the left of my hand holding a stalagmite with a couple labels on it. And the reason I have to go into the field is to collect these stalagmites that come from caves. And what I've found over the past 2 years is that the social connections that I get out of being in the field are just as important as the science. And this is a picture of me and a few of my friends on a caving field trip. And those connections that I've made with these friends have been even more fruitful in some ways than what I learned during that 2 or 3 hour caving trip. So for me, missing the trip is not an acceptable option. Some people say that one accommodation is just to make field trips not required. But I would argue that that's not a great accommodation. That's kind of a cop-out in my mind. So I've been trying to think a little bit more about how to make field trips accessible without saying, well, sorry, you just can't go. One thing that would really help is to provide as many details as possible and to ask your students or whoever you're helping out about their access needs before the trip. So even if you don't see that anyone in the room has a visible disability, it still makes sense to say, like, something along the lines of, let me know if you'll have any access needs or if you'd like to talk about the accessibility of this field trip. And that gives people a chance to at least ask you about it. It's also great to provide information in at least 2 formats while you're on the field trip. So, for example, it can be helpful to verbally say instructions and also have a field guide that's written. Another example would be to have a sample that you pass around for people to touch as you speak. There's a lot of different ways to do that and providing information in at least 2 formats, but I think it helps everyone, not just people with disabilities in the field. And finally, there are virtual field trips, which, as I said, I don't think are the perfect alternative, but it is one option if it's not possible to make the field trip more accessible. So you can actually make your own with a 360 camera. And both of these bullets here are blue because they're links, so you'll be able to access those links after the webinar. But I think that those are an interesting option, especially for people working in museums where you could have a virtual field trip in one room in your museum. I wanted to give a specific example of what's not helpful and what's more helpful when describing a field trip. I had someone say, it's a fairly easy cave. That was the only information I had before going on this caving field trip. What would have been much more helpful is if they had said, to get to our first sampling site, we have to hike 1 mile on a flat road to the entrance, then walk for 30 minutes in the cave on a gentle slope with some rubble. Because then people with disabilities are able to decide if that's something that their body can handle, if that's something that they are interested in doing, and it provides just a little bit more information for everyone as well. So for this kind of trip, I would want to bring hiking boots and not flip-flops, for example. What my journey and my health issues have shown me up to this point is that my scientific path is taking more of a turn than I knew it would. So this has 2 arrows showing a slight turn off of my original scientific path, more towards science communication and advocacy. And that's in part because I don't think that my body will be able to have a research career where I'm going into caves and I am functioning at the same level as other people who are completely able-bodied in the caving community. And it's also partly because I found that communication and advocacy are what I really love. So it's not just that I'm choosing a path that's easier, that's the only one I can take. It's also one that I think is a better path. So in a way, this has been a great way to see what's really important to me. It's not about pipetting for me as much as it's about communicating how much I love science and how much I think everyone should have access to science. So because I'm really interested in science communication, I wanted to make a couple points about digital media and how to make your digital media posts more accessible. My first points are about images here. So on Twitter, it's really important to use image descriptions, which is built into both the website and the app. You click on Add a Description, and then you just type in what the image shows. And that helps anyone who uses a screen reader or who can't view the image for some reason. On a website, you can use alternative text, and all of our pictures in our presentations have alternative text that you'll be able to look at. On Instagram, there's not a way to add an image description, but you can provide a description in a comment, and it's not an ideal solution, but until they add the capability to add image descriptions, that's one good option. And I would argue that you should consider that image description to be part of the metadata. So just like you wouldn't save an image of a specimen without writing down where it was from or who collected it and that type of information, you wouldn't want to save an image in a way that's not accessible to everyone. And with videos, it's really important to provide captions. I put a note here not to use auto-generated, quote, craptions, which don't work as well as one might think. So it can be really hard to use auto-generated captions to understand what's happening. And I encourage you to check out YouTube if you are hearing, and you can see how bad sometimes the auto-generated captions are. It's also important to not use any strobe or flashing effects without warnings because of both seizure risk and photosensitivity. So that's something you might not see on most do or don't lists, but it's something that really bothers me when I see really bright lights flashing at me. So it's been something I've started to notice. I'm also providing a link here for a site that makes it really easy to transcribe your videos. So it allows you to put in an audio file and then you can type as it goes. And it is one of several services out there, but it's free and I like it a lot. So that's why I'm including it here. My overall takeaways here is that everyone deserves to have access to science. I have a picture here of me as a second grader dressed up as Marie Curie, and I got really emotional when I was making this slide because I was thinking about how I would have had a career to this point if I hadn't been able to access museums and aquariums and all of the places that I loved going to as a child. And so that's why it's so important to me to accommodate and include everyone. And also remember that it's okay to ask questions. You don't need to know everything about disability. You don't need to already have all the information. You can ask polite questions about how to best accommodate people. Small adjustments can make a huge difference. So, for example, adding an image description on Twitter takes approximately 30 seconds, maybe less once you've gotten used to doing it a lot. But that makes a difference between your content being accessible and inaccessible to someone using a screen reader. And finally, just keep accessibility in mind for all events, online posts, and field trips. It shouldn't be an afterthought, just like Dr. Ayers said. It's something that's the right thing to do. I have a few links here for you to learn more, but I did want to provide a shout out to the International Association for Geoscience Diversity. I have a screenshot here of their resources on the right side of my screen, and they have resources for several different kinds of disabilities, including physical and mobility and blind and low vision resources, among others. So they are also linking here to the End the Awkward campaign that Dr. Ayers responded to, or mentioned. You have to log in and create a free account to access these resources, but it's definitely worth it. And finally, I have my contact information here. Feel free to get in touch with me if you want to talk about how to make your programs more accessible or how to navigate your own journey as a scientist with a disability. I have my links here to my email, Twitter, and Instagram. So that's all I have for us today. I'm just going to go back to my first slide here. And at this point, I can introduce Dr. Arielle Silvermen. She has a PhD in social psychology. She's also the founder of Disability Wisdom Consulting. So we're really excited to have her here to present about how to better incorporate blind and low vision students and scientists in programs. So I'm going to stop sharing, and Arielle, it's your turn.
All right. All right, thank you everyone. So my presentation is called Tips to Involve Blind and VI People in STEM, and VI is just an abbreviation for visually impaired. So a little bit about my background. I have a Bachelor of Science in Biology as well as a Bachelor of Science in Psychology, and then I went on to get a doctorate in Social Psychology. Actually defended my dissertation 4 years ago today, so I'm celebrating that today. And I was interested in studying social psychology because I wanted to understand the psychology of disability and the kinds of barriers that prevent people with disabilities from doing things that they want to do, including participation in careers of interest. And perhaps more importantly, I have been totally blind since birth, and I've been a longtime member for about 15 years of an advocacy organization called the National Federation of the Blind that has made a lot of progress in improving access to STEM for students who are blind and visually impaired. I founded my own company 2 years ago called Disability Wisdom Consulting. I'm based in Silver Spring, Maryland, but I work with clients all over the country on disability-related research and training projects. So for example, I have collaborated on some survey research asking teens and adults who are blind to describe their experiences with STEM and barriers that they've encountered. The training part of my company is working with audiences to train them to become more inclusive toward people with disabilities and all sorts of audiences. So I have kind of a unique perspective on this topic, and the reason that I'm focusing very specifically on blindness is not just because that's my personal area of expertise, but also because blindness is a very low incidence disability affecting less than 1% of the population, and so there's a lot of misconceptions about and a kind of lack of knowledge about blindness-specific access needs. So in the survey research that I collaborated on recently, it seemed that when people described barriers that they faced to accessing STEM, there were two main kind of categories of barriers. And so we would get a lot of responses when we would ask teens and adults who are blind how they feel about math and science. We would get a lot of responses saying, I love math and science, but I have trouble accessing them. And the two main types of barriers that seemed to come up were misconceptions and negative attitudes from instructors and kind of gatekeepers in these fields, as well as barriers to accessing visual information. So that's kind of what I'm going to focus on today. I would say probably the two most common misconceptions that I hear about blind people participating in STEM. The first one is some variant of a statement, X profession is too visual. So people might be told like, oh, you can't be a doctor, that's too visual. You can't be a chemist, that field is too visual, it's too visually oriented. And that's really not accurate because if you think about it, and I love the statement from one of my friends is totally blind and has a PhD in chemistry, and he says, you know, you can't see atoms. You can't see atoms with the naked eye. You can't see the Krebs cycle in action. You can't see sound waves. The only thing that we can see when we study these things are models and representations that other people have created to easily convey how those processes work, how atoms combine to form molecules, or how the Krebs cycle works, or how cellular mitosis works. We don't actually see these things in action. And so vision is not required to interact with these phenomena. Vision is simply kind of a convenient, flexible modality that we tend to use to represent STEM concepts, but it's certainly not the only way or even the best way all the time to represent those concepts. And then the other misconception that comes up a lot, I think especially for younger students, this idea that having a blind person in a lab is dangerous. And this kind of is based on a couple of false assumptions. One is that we are unaware of dangers in our environment, or that we'll kind of indiscriminately try to interact with our environment in ways that are dangerous without evaluating the possible risks. And so if there's a Bunsen burner on, whether I can access that Bunsen burner or not, if I know the placement of that Bunsen burner, I'm not going to burn myself. So some of that is common sense and kind of understanding that even without sight, people are aware of their environment, they're able to take appropriate precautions. And then, as we'll talk about a little bit later, there are technologies that allow blind people to interact with chemicals without touching them, for example, because touching chemicals would be dangerous. There are procedures and there are tools that we can use to safely function in a science lab. And of course, we can also use the method of strategic collaboration with other people. If there's some process that involves measuring chemicals that's not accessible and there's no way to do it without touching the chemicals, we can have someone else in charge of measuring the chemicals, and we can take responsibility of a different phase of the project. So I think those misconceptions that the fields are too visual or that the fields are dangerous are some of the main reasons why people are being dissuaded from pursuing their natural interest in STEM. But even if we overcome those barriers and we have instructors and gatekeepers who are willing to take a chance and allow blind people to participate, the other main barrier that people talk about is inaccessibility. And usually this occurs because, again, STEM is not inherently visual, but it is often represented in visual ways. And so a lot of instructors tend to rely very heavily on two-dimensional printed diagrams and images to represent phenomena. And if proper care is not taken to make those things accessible, blind people can be left out. And so here I want to suggest some multiple modalities and things to keep in mind to try to make your information accessible. I love the modeling that we saw with the other presentations where pictures were being described. And as you can see, the descriptions that were provided were not long or extensively researched. Even just saying, like, this is a picture of me when I was in 2nd grade wearing the Marie Curie uniform or whatever is enough information to give somebody access. So really, it's not a complicated process to describe pictures verbally. Of course, a lot of pictures will be, in STEM fields, will be more complicated than just a picture of a 2nd grader. But still, just that main principle of trying to naturally incorporate descriptions into your everyday dialogue. As far as the auditory modality goes, there are also technologies that talk, such as talking pH meters. I'm going to link to a website where you can buy a talking LabQuest device. Talking color detectors, if you need to figure out if a color change has occurred in a chemical solution, you can put a color detector on the outside of the test tube and be able to get that data in an auditory modality. Talking scales, these are all just examples of products that can be purchased to provide access. In the tactile modality, there are some fairly inexpensive ways to create raised line drawings. So basically converting a two-dimensional image into a two-dimensional drawing where lines and shapes can be felt. But sometimes raised line drawings don't work very well, especially for more complex things. As someone who has always been blind, I don't have a lot of familiarity with pictures. I have much more familiarity with three-dimensional objects. So if you hand me a cube, I'll know right away that it's a cube. But if you make me touch a raised line drawing of a cube, I have to feel it kind of one section at a time. And it'll take me a while to figure out that it's a cube. So I always appreciated in my STEM courses when professors would give me three-dimensional models. And a good example of that are the chemistry modeling kits that are available in mainstream university bookstores for like $20 that allow you to string together balls with holes that represent places where bonds form, and then you have these little bonds that put them together. And I found it very easy to mentally visualize molecules, even complex molecules, using those three-dimensional models. And then the last point I want to make is that sometimes it's not possible to provide equivalent access for a blind person to independently interact with something in STEM, and sometimes the best way is to create some kind of collaboration. The example that I want to give is in my freshman biology class, everybody worked in groups of 4. So this was not an accommodation that I was given specifically. This was just, I was part of a group of 4 students, and we were tasked with observing crickets and then designing an experiment to test or study to test some aspect of the cricket's behavior. And although crickets do make noise, most of the crickets' other behavior cannot be observed without using the visual modality, at least not very easily. So this was a time when I collaborated with the other students in my group, and they were able to provide me detailed enough descriptions of what the crickets were doing that I was able to come up with a hypothesis. And in this case, it was noticing that some crickets were more active than others and were jumping on the other crickets, and other crickets were just kind of not doing that. And eventually we designed an experiment to try to find out if the gender of the crickets affected their behavior and their interaction with other crickets. And so this is something that I was able to do based on the information I was given by other people. But I was still in charge of helping to design the hypothesis, recording data, and writing the report. So there are definitely ways that students can collaborate on, say, a microscope is another example where the information is just not available in any non-visual modality. But by deputizing another student or a collaborator, a colleague, to provide the information that's being shown in the microscope, the blind student can take on, in reciprocation, can take on more responsibility for the other parts of the experiment. And there's kind of a myth in general that if something can't be done independently, it can't be done at all. And in the case of disability, we kind of realize that sometimes interdependence is what makes the most sense. And people with disabilities have things to bring, and you also have needs. But everybody is interdependent. Everybody has strengths and weaknesses. And the more we can harness that, the better it is for all of us. So I'm wrapping up pretty soon, just kind of as a summary of tips for educators. Start by believing in the possibilities, so not getting bogged down in misconceptions about, oh no, this person can't see, they can't participate in this particular field, it's too visual or it's too dangerous. Try to let go of those assumptions and give the person a chance to prove themselves. Provide information in as many formats as possible, so being descriptive verbally while information is being presented in a visual format, providing access to electronic versions of PowerPoint slides, for example, so that using a screen reader we can follow along with what's being presented. Collaborating with a Braille production service to provide Braille if the student uses Braille. And providing tactile models and three-dimensional models whenever it is feasible. Inviting hands-on exploration, which is often the best way, not only for students who are blind, but really for all students to get a strong kind of sense of the material being taught. And setting a norm of collaboration and interdependence. So naturally having activities where people work together allows everyone to combine their strengths that complement each other to develop a better product. I have some links here to a couple of websites that you might find relevant. Independent Science is a company that creates some talking accessible chemistry equipment like the Talking Lab Quest, and also just provides some good information. The National Center for Blind Youth in Science provides information about some programs available for blind youth who want to improve their science knowledge and become more involved. American Printing House for the Blind is a good resource to learn about how to create raised line drawings and Braille products. And then the Journal of Blindness Innovation and Research is a journal that I co-edit that includes articles about education and rehabilitation of people who are blind and visually impaired. There was a special issue a few years ago that was all about tactile graphics, and we're expecting there might be another issue soon about that topic. And in general, we get a lot of submissions about teaching STEM. That journal is free and open access. And then finally, here's my contact information. Feel free to call me, email me, go to my website. There's a blog on my website that's updated every week, every Friday, that includes an article about some aspect of the disability experience. So sometimes it's me writing about my experiences or things that I want to teach about. Sometimes I share articles from other parts of the internet about disability. Sometimes I include guest contributors on the blog. If you want to subscribe to the blog, it's very easy. Just go to the website and type your email address in to be signed up to receive posts. And you'll also see, if you go to my website, the Facebook, Twitter handles for Disability Wisdom Consulting. Thanks so much. Should I stop share?
Yeah, how about we get Gabi's introduction slide, since it has everyone's name on it, back up. And thank you so much, Arielle. I really appreciate it. So we're going to be kind of switching gears from the presentation portion of our webinar to the Q&A and discussion. So unless, and we're welcome to turn the mics on for you guys to ask your questions, or if not, you can start typing them in, and Gabi and I will read them aloud to our speakers. I also put the survey link in there because as we're leaving, I want you guys to stay. But please remember to do the survey before we leave. And thanks, Gabi. So far you've gotten a thank you, and I definitely, from everybody, I want to thank our wonderful presenters. Each of you guys had a really great perspective and different perspective, and some great tips for us to at least start thinking about this in STEM. And specifically, a lot of us are collections folks that do both field work and have labs and have collections, and all of them have different considerations for how we can make them more accessible and more inclusive. As people are typing, I just want to say what I got really excited about was a lot of our projects are in the museums are using 3D scanning and 3D printing to create 3D models of museum specimens. And we've thought about using them for education, but I never thought about how they could possibly make collections a little bit more accessible, because you can, have a tactile experience with a 3D printed specimen that maybe you don't want the public touching normally, but you could make a copy of it and things like that. All right, we have our first question. I'll go ahead and read that one. I'm a professor in a medical school where the technical standards for admission are often used to deny admission to students, including deaf or low vision students. What are tips to even begin approaching this problem? And anyone can jump in.
I can somewhat address this. This is Kara. First of all, denying admission on the basis of disability alone is illegal and discrimination, and there are some court precedences on that. But I know that rarely does it come down to that being that simple. But sometimes it is helpful to start kind of staff education or people that are handling admissions with that reality, and then kind of go from there and understand how curriculum can be adapted and how it really is the expectation that curriculum be adapted. And just as an example, I know in psychology, so one of the requirements is administering assessments in a very standardized way. And so there are ways that can be adapted, though, so that the assessment can still render standard results. But say a blind psychologist could administer an intelligence assessment, which the standard protocol would require that someone be able to see what's being written, but you can adapt it in different ways, whether that be having a test proctor assistant, or there's a number of different ways. But I think it helps to start people so that they are also informed, so they're not inadvertently making decisions that are illegal and setting, no institution wants to be set up for that either. So it kind of raises everybody's motivation, and I don't, say it in a way to make people defensive, but rather that to give us the momentum we need to get on the right track to inclusion.
Does anybody else want to add to that? And thank you, Kara.
This is Gabi. I would just add that it might also be helpful to think about doing general not sure the exact right word, but I guess what Kara said, like, the word is escaping me now, of course, but basically diversity and inclusion training for all the staff that are there. The cultural competence, that's the word I was looking for. Because I'm sure that there are people at your institution who have disabilities, even if it's not visible or people don't necessarily talk about it. So I'm guessing it would make the whole community a more welcoming place if you had some kind of training like that, and that might translate to admissions.
I think these ideas are great. I guess the only thing I would add is perhaps consult if there's a question about whether someone with a particular impairment can't meet the standards, to consult successful medical professionals who have those disabilities, who can comment on how they overcame particular barriers associated with their impairments in order to become employed in the field. So for example, Tim Cords is a blind psychiatrist, and I'm sure he would be available for consultation on how someone who is blind can be admitted to medical school and pass all the requirements.
Right. Thank you. Those sound like really good suggestions. So we have a next question from Stacy. What are your suggestions for reaching younger students with disability in STEM outreaches? Many outreaches are focused on reaching other minorities and have focused on reaching women, but I haven't seen many resources for reaching students with disabilities, despite the fact that experts say the best way to increase participation is to create these pipelines. And Nicole echoed this. This was the question she had as well.
So this is Arielle. There's a program called Do It at the University of Washington that I completely forgot to include in my resource list. They run mentoring programs for young people who want to go into STEM, and they also have a lot of resources that can be used across different universities. I can try to look up the URL for them, but I think just if you look up the Do It or DO-IT program.
I think I found it. I just put it in the chat. Arielle, I think I found it. Yeah.
Yeah, this is Kara, and that's a great suggestion. And I think also, you know, as more elementary schools and middle schools and high schools are integrating STEM into their curriculum too, it's really important that we as scientists are also advocating and providing technical assistance when needed to educators for how to really meaningfully integrate students, so not just having students sit back and watch, kind of as Gabi mentioned, not just foregoing the field trips, but making them happen. And many times it's not that people don't want to, they just don't know how. And so offering ourselves as resources is a great step, and kind of reminds me that I need to reach out even to my kids' school and let them know that if you know, the STEM teachers had questions about how to make that happen, I would be happy to troubleshoot with them. You know, many times I'm also happen to be a parent of a child with a disability, and sometimes we get tired of being always the ones that are trying to figure these things out. So I think those of us in the field can kind of shoulder that weight and be allies and offer, because it really it starts young, and as Gabi's picture showed, that we have to give these opportunities and let young people with disabilities know that their interest and passion in science can result in a career that they love, and you know, we can figure it out together.
All right. Our next question comes from Brett. I'm in a 2 visual and 3-dimensional discipline, and that's in quotes, Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. Our Disability Center provided a note taker who was a graduate student for a visually impaired student in our large lecture. I've had some luck portraying 3D forms and images using a large amount of silly putty or modeling clay. That's very creative. The note taker would quickly form the shape with the clay and pass it to the students. This worked quite well in lecture. That's a very talented person, too. Do you have any other suggestions on portraying visual things quickly in lectures?
I think that's excellent. I guess the only caution that I would say about a note taker is I think that's a great role to have someone provide access to the 3D models, but I would not want that person to actually be taking notes for the student because taking notes is like actually physically writing down information is really enhances comprehension and learning. And I would hate for the student to miss out on that by just kind of sitting back and waiting for the notes to come in. So I think it's great that the person's there and that they're providing the three-dimensional models, but then I think allowing the students to take their own notes as well, and maybe they already do that, would be good. I guess the other thing is sometimes a student might have questions after the lecture about a particular image, and so providing access during office hours would also be good.
And Brett responded, it's true, taking your own notes is better, but this is an accommodation. I don't have much control over that. And I was just thinking, Brett, 3D printing. There's so many amazing, cool 3D models now. And if you knew what of course it couldn't happen during your lecture, it takes a little while, but if you knew, some crucial models for that lecture, you could even get graduate students involved, and if you have like a 3D printer at your library or a maker space or things like that. I don't know. All right, Stacy says, sorry for going back to this. Don't apologize. I ran out of time to type. What would you think about reaching out to disability-specific summer camps for STEM sessions during their camps? Just a thought about which I would appreciate feedback.
Yeah, this is Kara. I think that would be a fantastic idea. And then also reaching out to STEM. I'm here coming to you from Cincinnati, and we do have a few. I've seen a few pop up science-related camps, and also contacting them and making sure that they have what they need to be inclusive and feel prepared for that. I know our zoo camp here is working with our USED and LEND actually to figure out how they can be more inclusive of campers with disabilities. So yeah, I think disability programs are important, and also looking at the integrated programs as well to make sure that they're being inclusive.
All right, and Stacy says, also related to 3D printing, I'm involved in a great student volunteer organization called Enable the Future. They're looking for 3D printing projects related to disability and would be very receptive to the idea. That's really cool, Stacy. And if they have a link, would you mind throwing it in the chat? Also, as an aside, we will be taking this chat and turning it into a PDF, so it'll be a resource as well for the links and the questions and everything like that.
This is Gabi. Related to what we've been talking about, I also wanted to put in a quick plug for the fact that there are a lot of disabled people who do consulting work, or like Dr. Silverman has her own firm that she talked about. And just as you would pay a graphic designer to do artwork, you should probably consider also paying disabled people to help your programs become more accessible. And I know that nobody ever has enough funding, but it's something that might be worth looking into if you are interested in really overhauling a program or something like that.
That's a really great point. And I'm going to put on my NSF hat for a second and say the way we have funding for that is write it into your grant proposals. I know that's something NSF is looking for and is definitely interested in funding, is accessibility and broadening participation. So put the money in there when you're writing new grants. All right, Stacy's put the enable link into the chat, so thank you, Stacy. That's awesome. I can't wait to look into that and see if there's a way that we can kind of tap into that resource, since we have so many 3D models now. Does anybody else have any questions or comments that we'd want to ask the speakers? So it is now 4 o'clock, so I guess we should probably, I'll give like a minute or two for any last minute questions. Also, please, please, please do the survey. Give us feedback. Tell us what we can do better. Tell us what you liked. And I can share the survey results with our presenters, so if you have messages specifically for them. And people are saying thank you and great information. And I really thank you guys for coming. I really appreciate the great conversation we just had. Kathleen says she's encouraged by this discussion as a paleontologist, medical professional, and mother of a son with multiple disabilities. Thank you, Kathleen, for coming and participating. I really appreciate it. And thanks most of all to our 3 presenters, Arielle, Gabi, and Kara. Thank you guys so much. It was a great conversation. Yeah. And I will be...
Thank you for putting this together.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Thank you, guys. I will be posting the recording with this, and we're going to be creating a transcription of the recording, which will probably take a few more days to do that. But we will be posting the presentations and the chat and everything like that on our website. Let me grab the link real quick. But thank you all for coming,